All right, hello everyone. I'm Saul Messing, Chief Scientist at ACRONYM, and this is a look beyond traditional audiences and models. Uh, so I like as much interactivity as possible, so please be sure to use the Q&A functionality, which is in a different tab than the actual chat. I can't see the chat, but I can see the Q&A. Okay, so what does it mean to be a chief scientist in a political organization? So I try to get the best evidence available, and I try to do that in a rigorous way. So that means how we run experiments. That means what tactics work best. How do we produce success metrics? And then what I'll focus on today, which is audience strategy, where to advertise and who to try to reach, so we get the most bang for our buck. In scientific terms, that means optimizing spending to maximize net electoral votes. Now, if your understanding of political advertising comes from Hollywood or even the print media, you might think that us data scientists were basically some sort of magicians who could make or break the election. But you can't just robocall a bunch of gun owners and easily convince them to support a Democratic candidate, which is the plot of season 4, episode 9, House of Cards, and which is depicted in the GIF here. In reality, the effects that we're talking about are much smaller. We have much less influence than that all suggests, especially in a presidential election. In a presidential election, though, these small effects, they really matter. Thanks in particular to the electoral map in the US. That means if the election is close in a battleground state, increasing your vote share by 0.5% could affect who's in the White House. Okay, most of us very sort of all know this. The point, though, is that to see these small effects, you got to do everything just right, and you need a ton of data. So what I do is try to do that, which is generally in the form of running power analysis, which is just a nerdy way to say, look, we need more data than you're giving us for the most part. So what we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk is sort of the playbook here. So how do we choose the right target audiences? How do we pick the right map? And then how do we measure impact? How do we know if what we did actually worked? So let's talk about general strategy for a minute. The way we do traditional modeling based off the voter file leaves a lot of people on the table. Of course, the working theory here is if you're doing persuasion, you want to reach as many people as possible, and the people in the middle who are going to vote for sure. Persuasion is doubly valuable, or so we thought, because it moves votes from one column to the other, netting 2 votes in total. But if you form your audience that way, you're not going to talk to some of the most important people that we ought to reach. That's because some machine learning model from a voter file vendor might suggest that these folks have probably already made up their mind, or that they maybe have less than a 90% chance of showing up to the polls on election day. And it's really easy to look at those hard numbers and to get the sense that you're able to predict whose mind you can change and who's going to vote in the next election. But people are just unpredictable. It's really important to approach the task of targeting with a little bit of humility. So what we've done, and others have done this too, is we try to run an experimentally informed program, or a social science informed program, we like to say, which is we run experiments to figure out which ads resonate the most with what kinds of people, and we look at who's going to be most likely to respond to ads in the first place. It's actually harder to get right than it sounds, because it's really easy to be fooled by randomness. And there's a lot of noise in message testing, especially for a single message. That's why we try to inform our program based not only on experiments, but also based on publicly available political science and other partner organizations' findings And in particular, I'd like to thank the Analyst Institute for making that available to the community. Okay, so we had some evidence early on that boosted news worked particularly well among a low knowledge audience. So in this case, what we saw was that a boosted news story covering Tucker Carlson, who was railing against Donald Trump's decision to kill Iranian General Soleimani, worked very well. In general, it was very persuasive, and in particular among this low knowledge subgroup. That's the low information subgroup that you see up above. That looks like an estimate of about 4%, and it looks like in total this moved voters by around 1 or 2 percentage points, which in political advertising in the presidential context is a big effect. Now, it turns out that this finding is not quite as robust as we would like, and if you clean and analyze the data, making different choices, the pattern becomes less pronounced. But we saw a lot of low knowledge voters who were consistently persuaded in our survey experiments that we ran. And what's more, there's a great deal of existing social science that supports this sort of finding, right? There's a lot of work, for example, from Brockman and Kalla that supports the notion that showing people new information is the best way to persuade them, in particular folks who don't consume a lot of information in general and so don't have these sort of strong pre-existing priors. Okay. Okay, so how did we operationalize all this? Well, we built a model with Civis to model low information voters based on survey data that they collected on media consumption habits and education, and we formed a model. We then uploaded that audience to Facebook and to other platforms. Of course, the really difficult thing here, though, is that Facebook doesn't match everyone that you upload. Not everyone's on Facebook, and the file doesn't have great email and mobile phone data. It's got great addresses, but Facebook doesn't seem to rely on home address to match people to the file or from the file to its system. So when we uploaded custom audiences with different and distinct age categories, for example, there's actually a lot of age overlap in those audiences according to our surveys and Facebook's own numbers. And that's almost certainly due to false positives when you're matching. So that's a problem. There's another item that I should quickly mention, because a lot of people, when they hear Facebook, when they hear these sort of online advertising, the first thing they think of is lookalike matching. Because one of the cool things about these online platforms with respect to advertising is that you can really kind of get a group of people that look like your audience who's moving. Now, I got to tell you, though, that when we tried to do this, we had recruited people to take surveys on Facebook, and we had Facebook match those people. But what happened was that the audience that Facebook gave us back were sort of seeming to have very little in common, except maybe that they seemed to take surveys at higher rates than everyone else. So the value proposition is maybe not as clear for those folks, or for that system as we would like. It didn't do quite what we had hoped it was going to do. It still is probably pretty useful if you're getting data from another source like the voter file, rather than just surveys. Okay, so it's important to quickly touch on turnout, and it's very difficult with a turnout program to run a bunch of survey experiments or field experiments and measure turnout via survey. The reason that's the case is because most people say they're going to vote, but a big chunk of them don't. And then even among those people who say they won't vote, a lot of those people actually do vote. So it's very difficult to ask people how they're going to vote, to ask people whether they're going to vote, and have draw meaningful conclusions from that. What people tell you about the odds that they'll vote has little to do with what actually happens on election day, or in the case of 2020 election, like months. So it's incredibly difficult to do this sort of strategy that we did, where you're iterating on effective ways to increase whatever outcome measure you want based on what you're seeing in your surveys, your survey experiments, or your field experiments. So we have some preliminary evidence our turnout program increased early voting among individuals with the lowest turnout scores, but the evidence is the effects are very noisy, as they are in most cases for this. Okay, so what we recommend though overall is looking at past studies on actual turnout measured via the voter file, or an approach like our Expand the Electorate program, where you have registrations or sort of website actions recorded in the data, and you can use those to iterate, use those as KPIs and iterate on the most effective approaches that you might implement. Okay, so the key takeaways for audience targeting, it's don't just target based on conventional wisdom. Got to look at who's actually changing their mind, at least in the social science, if not in your own RCTs with your own creative and your own audiences. What worked for us in particular was targeting low information voters. They seem to be most responsive, and we believe that going after voters with lower propensity scores, who are generally lower information voters, is the way to go. All right, so there's more to defining your audience than just that, though, because persuading all likely voters in California is pretty worthless. You need to be, sorry, not all likely voters. Persuading all the persuadable voters in California is probably worthless. So you got to be careful, right, in terms of the targeting that you use in each state. You got to figure out what states to go into. Ordinarily, folks use survey data to create election forecasts and then perform what's called tipping point analyses, where they try to predict the states that are most likely to sway the election based on data and analytics. But the polls were way off this time. You know, we lost Florida, we lost North Carolina, we won Michigan and Wisconsin by razor-thin margins, and the polls said we were going to win all those states pretty much, except maybe, depending on which poll you look at, maybe Florida. Back in August, in addition, when we needed to make a final decision about which states to enter, the polling error was probably worse than in the last months of the election, which are the polls we all remember. So luckily for us, what we did was we made a set of internal projections based on the past vote history in each state. We used those projections to help make the decision to go into Georgia. Our projections that showed the Democrats just losing, but the polling looked good. And the fact that Georgia had 2 Senate seats in play kind of sealed the deal. It kind of convinced us that's probably where we ought to be spending if we're going to go into any other states besides the ones we were in, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. I say Pennsylvania and Arizona. Anyway, okay, so that's to say that you got to be careful where you spend. And when you get people to vote for your candidate, they also vote for your party down ballot in the Senate, in the House, in local elections, which is again another point in Georgia's favor. So when we look back and evaluate state level polling versus these projections based on only vote history, we did much better than the actual polling data. The error, that's the error for the surveys. That's this middle white column. You can see the average error. Whoops. Is sorry, we have a malfunction here. The average error is almost 5 points. The average error for this projections, the set of projections we made, was only about 2 points. So we did quite a bit better than the polls. So we haven't done a full evaluation of other years. We haven't what's called back tested this against a lot of other elections. And it's also possible that if we hadn't had COVID, which may have induced a lot of issues with the polling this time around, it's possible this would look different. So that analysis may be coming in the future, but we don't have it now. Okay. Okay, so one thing that we did this time around, which as far as I know, just hasn't been done at scale, is to measure our program against a randomly assigned holdout audience. So we have for our entire program, essentially a sort of RCT model that we can use to evaluate our overall effectiveness. And so what this does is it allows us to ask whether we actually affected, who votes and kind of how they voted. So let's look at what we have there. So we surveyed both that program audience and the holdout or control audience on election day. And we found that our overall program had about 0.5 percentage point effect in our, Biden-Trump trial heat. Now, that estimate was, we didn't have quite enough people in our survey to get a really sharp estimate there. And that estimate's not statistically significant. What's more, we found that the effect was for our low knowledge, low information audience from 1 to 3 percentage points. So it's bigger for the folks who had trouble answering questions about civics in that survey. But one piece of evidence that is super clear is that the conservative leaners in our persuasion program were less likely to vote prior to election day. This is early voting data. It's important to make that clear. This is the final voting tallies are not back yet, but the early vote data is. And what we can see is that among the people with the target smart Trump support score greater than 60, we see approximately a 1 to 3 percentage point difference in turnout between holdout and our program. And we've done some initial analyses that show the effect is not quite maybe that big when it's specified under different and probably better specifications, but it's at least 0.5 percentage point, which is a big effect. And the effect is pretty clear here. So what does this all mean? Well, I think there's a few key takeaways that we want to make sure we emphasize before we get to the Q&A here. So targeting your audience based on social science works. And when you're trying to figure out what states to go into, relying on trends in prior year vote returns can really help. And it can do it a lot earlier. You can make those projections a lot earlier than you can with survey data or conventional wisdom. Finally, it would be ideal, it would be amazing if everyone in the future could create some type of program holdout so we can know the real world impact of these programs moving forward. Okay, I'm going to move on to the Q&A now. And I think we're doing good on time. And so the first question is, how did you define and capture a low information audience to be targeted? And we sort of covered this a little bit, but the low information audience was defined based on a battery, 3 questions that ask about civic knowledge, knowledge of who controls the House, how long is a Senate term, and one more, which is slipping my mind. But if you answered less than 2 out of those 3 correctly, you're considered low information for the purposes of our program. Now, I think it's interesting to point out that unlike questions about media consumption, which kind of ask people to report how often they consume news and political information, what this does that's kind of interesting and in my view a little better is it actually relies on the person's, well, either their knowledge or their motivation to go look up the answers in Google for this. And so by asking them to take some action, you make answering the questions a little more costly than if you just say, hey, do you consume a lot of civic information? To which probably more people say yes to than they should. Or they over-report it, basically. Next question. So are there any audience segments that you couldn't reach in 2020 that you want to try and reach in 2022? There are a lot of audience segments that we can't reach, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is we tend to define these audiences using the voter file. And so if we're going to define our audiences using the voter file, we know that people with low vote propensities tend not to be on the file. If you've never voted, you're probably not on the file. If you have lower income, if lower SES, non-whites and non how do I put this? Non-whites and Hispanics tend to be on the voter file at slightly lower rates. And so, yeah, there are a lot of Democrats who we, would like to reach who we can't reach just using the voter file, first and foremost. Second, because of the matching issues I discussed earlier, and this sort of this will tie things together a little bit, we can't, at least using the voter file, target as many people as we might like on social media or on digital, and hopefully we can figure out some, interesting and innovative ways to use the data that these companies have for targeting purposes moving forward. Though there does seem to be kind of a at least right now at this moment, Facebook in particular seems not to want to have much to do with politics. So it's unclear whether Facebook will even be an option for political advertising moving forward. Okay. So can we talk about age in digital as a factor? Are you getting a large percentage of older voters, and can you tell if they're representative? Well, this is an interesting point. When we formed our audiences, we thought that we would be targeting younger voters, and we of course would love to reach every young voter, and young voters tend to be on these platforms. But the people who answer surveys tend to be older. So the older folks click on things at much higher rates than everyone else. And this can kind of create a situation where you've got, if you got everyone on Facebook, for example, to take your survey or your field experiment post survey or whatever it is, you'd have an audience that was too young. And if you got if you just recruited people from who are cooking on stuff on Facebook, you get an audience who's too old, because only old people tend to click on stuff at much higher rates. But this tends to balance out for at least a single survey when you go to recruit people to take surveys on Facebook. So that's great. Though it is the case that if you have a pre-survey, you issue creative to folks after a random assignment, and then you have a post-survey, the people who take the post-survey have gone through this sort of, old age clicking process twice, and those folks tend to be a little older. You can, of course, adjust for that using statistical techniques, but it's definitely a factor in terms of representativeness. Okay, so there's another question on how we identify low information voters. We can't survey everyone in our audience, so do we build models based on the survey? In short, yes. Though what we've done in the past is we've built these models with other folks, with Civis, and what we've done is we've used Civis's data to they have a lot of surveys, and they are able to use those surveys with the voter file to create an audience, which is how we modeled low information voters. We also took folks who were low education and included them in that segment. Okay, so do I have thoughts on applying what we learned with much smaller campaigns? And I think if we're talking about smaller campaigns that are not presidential election campaigns, we're in a little bit of a different situation. And the reason is because the effects that you're going to see in those campaigns are going to generally be quite a bit bigger. So when you're in that world, you've got a little bit of a better situation with respect to survey experiments, because you can really get a much clearer read on what's working and what's not. Okay, so let's see. Are there any recent targeting studies that I've seen that excite me, or any that are concerning? I think the most exciting work that I've seen recently is maybe not a targeting study per se, but it's a study where people are texting their friends, and those folks tend to vote at much higher rates when it's the friend that's contacting them, rather than when it's us, or it's a media thing, or it's someone who they don't know who's texting them in a cold call. But if you got this warm contact where a friend of yours reaches out to you to say, hey, just want to make sure you're registered to vote. It's a really important election this time around. That strikes me as really important. It's very difficult to collect that data. It's very difficult to sort of figure out, once you've got that data, to join it with the voter file. And then once you do that, to try to figure out, okay, can we come up with a prioritization for who we think you, the sort of texter, ought to text among all your friends and social contacts. Let's see. How long do we have here? We have a little bit more time. Yeah. So we've got a bit more time, so I'll keep going with some of the questions. These are great questions so far. Okay. How are you thinking about how progressives might keep new Democratic voters voting for Democrats this year and in next year's elections, considering how voters historically tend to turn away from the president's party in midterm elections. So voters, as an aggregate, tend to turn away from the president's party in midterms. But a lot of that has to do with the other side being angry about the fact that their candidate's not in office, the most visible office in the land, and the other side, the bad guys are running the ship, or sailing the ship. And I think that's definitely a possibility. And I think this really speaks to the importance of making sure that, to the extent possible, we keep these voters engaged in the midterms. I think that's going to be a real challenge, in particular because Trump was such a loud and obnoxious and anger-inducing and backlash-inducing voice that I think motivated a lot of people to get out there and organize and register and vote. And so keeping that enthusiasm up, I think, is going to be really important moving forward. Okay, so next question. To the extent that high information voters are more interested in politics, more likely to talk about it with their friends, and so on, persuasion among these folks might have larger indirect effects through their social networks. Could this offset larger direct effects on low information voters? Well, ideally, what you would do, right, is you would find these high information voters who are generally very involved in politics and very much the sort of the people who tend to engage in activism or be active in their communities. And so if that's the case, you would want to try to engage them as this sort of seed contacts for people who you want to do outreach to, whether it's via text or whether it's via door knocking or whether it's some other form of organizing. These are the folks who you want to be your sort of core nodes in this network of activism and persuasion. And so I think it's a really good point. Generally speaking, those folks tend to already have their minds made up about politics, though, and so it's unclear that you would be able to persuade them of anything, regardless of how big your campaign was. So it's a tricky thing. We're getting close to the end here, and the last question I think I'll tackle is one that is, what are you most proud of having achieved last year? I'm most proud of two things. So, well, I'm most proud of the team, of putting this amazing team together. But after that, in terms of what we all achieved, I think I would say that I am most proud of putting together the Dorothy framework that James talked about. No one really has been able to really get a handle on the relationship between what you do on social media platforms and actual persuasion. And because we conducted so many in-field RCTs and so many survey experiments, and we had so much data from the platforms, at least from Facebook, not only on what people are clicking on, but how they're reacting to the content. What we were able to do is we were able to model this. We were able to put together a machine learning model that predicted what was most likely to indicate persuasion on a particular ad or news story that we promoted. And one of the strongest signals that's there, and this is consistent across Facebook and our own kind of additional attempts to model persuasion just using surveys and emojis is that when people are laughing at your ad, it seems to indicate that they are, unless it's a funny ad, that there's backlash. And it seems to be a pretty consistent predictor. It's also the case that if someone is sad, and possibly if they're angry, that seems to suggest that persuasion might be happening. Sorry, if they react with a sad or an angry emoji, I should be more precise there. I'm also incredibly proud of the fact that the entire organization was so behind the social science here that they were willing to maintain a holdout throughout the entire campaign and to use social science, and in particular the experiments that we ran, to help inform what ads we were putting into this big, tremendous program in the battleground states this year. Let's see. I know that we were a little bit running behind, so what I might do is end a couple of minutes early here, just to make sure that we have enough time for our next talk.